Hello, and greetings from the United States, where I guess I'm in quarantine for 2 weeks because I just flew internationally. This is my quarantine, my lovely quarantine in this beautiful hotel. Um, my name is Joe Crescente. I'm the Media Literacy Fellow, and we thank you for tuning in for this session of the Media Literacy Discussion Club. Don't be a stranger. Let us know what you think about this program by liking it or leaving a comment. To join our other AMC online programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, check updates on our website, amc.ru, and follow us on social media to learn, connect, and produce together. All right. So this week is going to be a continuation of the presentation that I began last week. So it is media literacy, why it's important, and how it can be used to build other forms of knowledge. This is part 2. And so just to remind you to change the slide, these two presentations taken together are both a thorough introduction to media literacy, as well as a practical guide for teachers, in particular English language teachers, to help them think about incorporating these concepts into the classroom, right? So changing the slide, part 1 is available on YouTube for those of you who missed it and would like to see the first part. I mean, you don't need to see the first part to understand the second part. It's nothing like that, but in particular for instructors or students, you might want to check it out. It could give you a bit of a fuller picture overall. All right, so changing the slide. When I explain what media literacy is to a new audience, I often use analogies from everyday life to help clarify what I mean. I feel like that helps people see what I'm talking about a lot more clearly. So for example, when I want to learn a city, to become literate in that city, I put away my GPS, right? Because I understand that I must build up my skills and instincts, right? If you're constantly, get your phone out and looking at directions and like this, you're not really paying attention to all the things going on around you. So when you're navigating a city, you have to build up your skills and instincts in order to get to know it well, right? So changing the slide. So how did I learn to get around Moscow, right? Moscow's not an easy city, to learn. And to some degree, it's a lifelong learning project. It's not like New York, which has, it's quite, New York City is quite easy because you have numbers and grids. It's very clear how to move. If you're going up in numbers, you're going north. If you're going down in numbers, you're going south. This is Manhattan, of course, not in the other outer boroughs. St. Petersburg, the geography is so specific and unique that, I was able to actually figure out that city quite easily. You have Nevsky Prospect, which goes along, through the heart of the entire center. And then you have all these, islands and canals and rivers and bridges and stuff to help kind of give you an idea of where things are located. So I didn't have that problem in St. Petersburg, but Moscow, I must say, is a bit of a challenge. It's an enormous city, and it is an ancient city that grew up in ways that more modern cities haven't. So there are challenges, and there's a beauty to it, of course, as well. But there certainly are challenges for the contemporary person getting around and figuring it out. So just change the slide. The first times I stayed in Moscow, I didn't get to know it that well, right? I was addicted to my phone's directions, and I let them guide me around, and it helps in the sense of get from point A to point B. It helps you in a survival mode type of thing, but it doesn't really help you to get to know things that well on your own. So changing the slide. And there were a couple times I remember when my phone just, ran out of battery life and it died, and I was just completely helpless in the middle of this, really old city that's got a lot of curves to it that you can't necessarily see what's around the bend. If you're in certain neighborhoods, you don't really have the geographical markers to help you figure out where you are. You can't always see the Moskva to help you along. You can't always see the Kremlin, to kind of guide you in a certain way. So it can be challenging. Getting lost in Moscow is less fun than getting lost in some other cities, because it is, it's a challenging city to navigate, when you first get there. But now, recently, I really try hard to not use my phone. In particular, the last year, when I was going around Moscow, I tried really hard to keep the phone in the pocket, and I figured out, that the more that I do that, the better I get to know things, and I don't need to look it up. So when I would take a long walk, I just try to let my instincts guide me. And in this way, I'm building up my navigational skills. I get better at looking for clues, guideposts, and signs. And for the most part in Moscow, I don't even need the phone, because getting around the huge metropolis became second nature. So for me, I mean, I see the similarities between this and media literacy. I think a lot of people are very intimidated, by the news landscape. Oh, there's so much fake news. I don't know what's real. I don't understand media. What's the difference between this media and that media? Traditional forms of media. But similarly, the more that you invest time into getting to know it, in learning how to trust it at some level, to trust what your instincts are, because you've gotten to know media quite well, you've gotten to know different sources of media quite well, it can become second nature. But it does take a little bit of work to get there, for sure. But the more that once you look at stuff a lot, you read a lot of different kinds of media, you ask yourself good questions about what's going on here, the more that you'll be able to see, there's a good headline there. I could see that the sources here are really, really thorough and good. That must mean, maybe this is a pretty good source. Or, you could see that there's some transparency to the way that the reporting is done, on the website. Then, the more that you get to look for these things, and they become second nature to look for these things, the easier it is to feel comfortable in a media space, right? I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable because, their phone has died, and they're in the middle of, this medieval city, and they can't figure out how to get around the bend. So changing the slide, media literacy in some ways is also like learning a foreign language. Understanding words aren't enough. You need to know what to listen for. So changing the slide again. Just suppose you're in a store in a foreign country, and you know all the relevant words that you think you need, right? Cashier, change, credit card, cash, how much, how much does something cost, right? But instead of hearing these words, what you really need to answer, the questions you're being posed are, do you need a plastic bag? Do you have the store's discount card? And so on, right? Changing the slide, you get flustered, and part of you feels like giving up. You are unprepared for the scenario by your textbook that you thought taught you all the relevant vocabulary that you could ever need, right? And I think this is what happens to a lot of people, when they sit and really try to analyze what's going on in the media, right? They thought they knew what to do, but things have become so incredibly complex and complicated that they get flustered, and they just tune out rather than try to figure out. And that's not necessarily the best strategy for us humans in the 21st century, I think. Changing the slide again, when analyzing the media, you have to know what to look for, right? What differs from the original idea of literacy is that you're trying to analyze more than just words. Why this article, right? Why now? What is the bias or point of view of this publication? What is this source they are using? These are some things you can ask yourself. So to change the slide, the analysis is not exclusively on the page, but is often behind the scenes, right? Like learning a foreign language, you need to know what to be prepared for in different situations. And the more that you get used to it, the easier it becomes, right? So what I say here, right, it's often behind the scenes. It doesn't mean that there's some conspiracy going on by any means. But, people aren't going to tell you, hey, we're a great source, or hey, we're a bad source. You've got to look for certain things. You got to look for, what makes this publication transparent, or, what is it about the journalists in this publication that help out, right? Or what are some things that you could take away or think about that can help you understand if this is a good source or not. Changing a slide again. So, like being in a store as a foreign language learner, you should be prepared for some of the challenges you might face. So let's look at some of these challenges that I've come up with. Changing the slide again. So challenge one is that so many messages are being transmitted that we often don't have the time or the resources to check them all for accuracy. This is what most people say, like, I just don't have time. I don't have time for the media. I don't have time to check everything. I just want to have, I work really hard. And, if I see something funny on social media, I'm going to share it. I don't have time to check everything. Who has time for this? And this is true. It's also true that, we should take a responsibility for these things, I think, because, I've definitely seen situations where people take something very seriously that somebody has shared because they said, "Oh, my friend shared it, so it must be true." And then these falsehoods get shared dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and they can even become viral. So, changing the slide, as I've mentioned already, right? This is a huge problem. This overwhelming number of messages out there, and one of the main reasons is some people give up on their path to becoming media literate, right? Same thing, like, right? People sometimes stop after a year learning a foreign language because they realize it takes more work than they were willing to put into it. But for media literacy, I'd argue that it's not just worth it. I think it's necessary because there's so much bad information out there that it really is just as integral as reading and writing, was, say, a century ago. There's a reason why literacy is in the statement, right? It is something that we as 21st century humans need to be able to figure out how to communicate in this world. So changing the slide again, right? As I've mentioned, right? Existing in this media world, there was a book I read called Media Worlds, which just really tried maybe 10 years ago. That really just tried to describe all the different ways that media integrates itself into societies and how that differs from society to society. It was quite interesting. So sometimes I think back to that term media worlds, right? So this media world that we exist in, right, where there's social media, there's traditional media, there's all sorts of things, other things being shared, all sorts of messages are being shown to us on television, in advertising and so on. It's exhausting. It's overwhelming, right? You can't check everything, right? And it's true that we can't check everything. But if something is floating around and it smells bad and you have a moment, you should check it out, right? You obviously don't have time to check everything all the time. But if you see something and it stands out to you as being potentially untrue, really, if you have 2 minutes, check it out. Once you start knowing what to do, you can fact check stuff in a minute or 2 minutes from your phone very easily. So that's my basic piece of advice. If something smells bad to you and you have a moment, please check it out. Just take a look at its headline, sources, who do they quote, what is the publication. That can give away a lot of really crucial information as to whether or not it's a good source. If we all did this just a little bit, right, then our media space would get a little bit more truthful. We'd clean it up a lot more. And, I think people would begin to trust what they're seeing a little bit more. I mean, I think the biggest crisis right now is like major lack of trust, in information and in the media and so on. And anything we can do to, lessen that and, get people to be a little less cynical about stuff is good. But as I'll go over a little bit later, there's a difference between cynicism and skepticism, and it's a very important distinction. Changing the slide again. Falsehoods will never completely die out, but if there are fewer and fewer of them, they will stand out more, right? I think the biggest problem today is that people just see them everywhere. They think everything they see is a potential falsehood. They don't know what to believe. Um, but if we take the time to really sniff out some really bad falsehoods and misinformation, and there's fewer and fewer of them, the ones that are false, fake, whatever you want to call it, they will stand out more. They will become more obvious to people, and they will have a harder time gaining traction. I think that it wasn't that long ago that it was just like if something was really wildly conspiratorial sounding, maybe 20 years ago, it stood out a lot more. It seemed like there was mostly uh, good news, and I'm not saying that it was all perfect by any means. The media has always had its challenges, and doesn't always get everything 100% correct. But I think that the stuff that was really off the wall stood out a lot more. I think today most people think everything's off the wall, and that the really good news is the thing that stands out. Um, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's got a lot to do with the level of trust that people have. I mean, as I've said many, many times, the vast, vast majority of journalists are highly ethical people, very well trained, do a very good job. But this atmosphere we have of mistrust has gotten to such a degree that that puts quite a bit of pressure on them. And I don't think there's a lot of understanding of what it is that journalists do. And my hope is actually, I'm trying to see if this will be possible to maybe a little later in the summer invite some journalists to the Media Literacy Discussion Club. Just for the simple fact of being able to demystify their profession, talk about it, talk about what they do, so that you can, participants can get a better sense of what they do and get to understand, what kind of challenges they have, what goes into making articles, so that you hopefully can have a little bit more trust in the profession as well. I'll also take this time because I just remembered. So starting next week, we will be going into Zoom format to have a little bit more conversation possibilities. So just keep that in mind, so that we'll be changing the format a little bit, less of just a lecture and then some questions at the end, and more of kind of discussion, proper discussion, rather than just a presentation. But largely, the format will stay mostly the same. There'll just be more possibilities for interaction between us. So let's get to the second challenge, changing the slide. Challenge number 2. We've mentioned this already, right? So many messages in circulation enables those wishing to embellish, exaggerate, or completely inflate their messages to sometimes get falsehoods through with impunity. I mean, this is really frustrating when you see somebody and they get, that they're not telling the truth, or they've kind of bended the truth a little bit and they get away with it. It can be very frustrating for sure. Changing the slide. And these people, they're definitely people out there who are counting on your feeling of powerlessness, right? What can you do? Everybody, there's so many people, not telling the truth, or, embellishing it or changing it a bit, and there are people out there who, count on you to do nothing. They're totally ready to take advantage of it. And I could, it's very frustrating when you see people get away with falsehoods, but what can you do about it, right? I personally see friends, and these are educated, smart people, who seem to have no problems with the partial truth if the full one is too complicated, right? And I think it's this idea of like, if everybody's doing it, why not you? If everybody's going to take this advantage, why shouldn't I as well? So changing the slide, this is what we're up against, and I encourage you to, for lack of a better term, take the high road, to go high. When people go low, we go high, as the Obamas used to say. Because we have to try to ensure that we don't become apathetic, right? Apathy is you know, the biggest result of a lack of trust in media, right? You just stop believing in everything, you just tune it out completely, and then you're not even really participating in society anymore at some level. And large segments of the population can get to that point because they're just so tuned out because they just don't believe anything that's going on. So we have to ask ourselves, especially those who want to, become media literate, who are committed to the idea of media literacy, what can we do as individuals to make ourselves more informed? And what can we do to help others do the same? It's one thing for me to get up and do a live stream once a week. It's another thing to spend a little bit of time, when I say, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, well, I kind of specialize and study and teach stuff regarding media literacy. And I spend a lot of time, I feel like half the time, half of my responsibility is just telling people what that is. Everybody's curious about it, but a lot of people don't know what it is, and the suspicion levels are so high. And I spend a lot of that time, when people have questions about media literacy, not me talking, but me listening. And definitely a friend or a colleague who has a lot of skepticism about media. One of the best things you can do is just sit and listen, and you might find that there's a way in to help them take better responsibility for their media habits. All right, moving along. Changing the slide again. We've talked about some challenges, but we have to make sure that we don't overburden ourselves. Right? It's useful to remind ourselves of some goals from time to time. Right? With the media, it's definitely easy to get burnt out. I definitely suggest, when you get to a point where you're just, feeling really overburdened by, figuring out media, it's okay to take a break for a few days. For certain, there's been times in the last 3-4 months where I watched a little bit too much news coverage about COVID-19. And I just need to take a break for 3 days. Honestly, nothing really changes in a global way that affects me in 3 days if I take a couple days off from it. And I've mentioned digital detoxes in other presentations. This conscious, taking a weekend off or a week or something to clear your mind. It can really help you a lot and be a better functional person, both in your individual and societal lives, right? And professional lives, for sure. If your mind is just getting so overwhelmed with messages, take a break. It is totally a good, productive thing to do. Even if it sounds like you're not being productive, you're actually being productive by doing nothing in this regard and just taking a little time to clear your mind a little bit. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with messages these days. So to change the slide, one goal of media literacy is to give ordinary people tools to know how to spot inaccuracies and how to engage with the media in order to prevent them from occurring again. Changing the slide. Like I've been saying, media literacy is a skill set, right? Like learning a foreign language, like figuring out a city, like learning an instrument, right? Musical instrument. The more you engage with this skill set and learn about it, the easier and more natural it will become for you to spot things that are intentionally or unintentionally misinforming and spreading falsehoods. Changing the slide again. Daniel J. Levitin wrote an important book in 2016 called Weaponized Lies: How to Think Critically in the Post-Truth Era. In the book, he posits that it's a lack of education that's impacting our ability to understand media. And arguably, it's this idea that, people leave off the literacy part of media literacy, and they don't think that, media is something that really needs to be taught in schools. But, I think it's very important. He also suggests that it's primarily the use of language that obscures rather than reveals in a concrete sense that undermines our ability to make decisions as a society. He cites the Oxford Dictionary's definition of post-truth which was the word of the year, I think, in 2016, as something that relates to or denotes, quote, circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Changing the slide again. Levitin thinks we're being a bit too playful when referring to falsehoods. The very idea of fake news hides more than it shows. It shuts down conversations rather than leads to critical thinking, right? I'm very suspicious anytime somebody just says, "Oh, that's fake news." That for me basically means when I hear that, I'm like, this person doesn't have a rebuttal, doesn't have any way to argue with this. They might even know that it's wrong, but they're hoping that if they apply the term fake to it, that this conversation will stop, and the person they're interacting with won't be able to call them out on this. Could also mean that I just don't understand what this is, and or I don't have the time to really get to know what this is, so I'll just label it fake. And for me, that's easier than really sitting and trying to figure out what's going on. So Levitin argues the truth still matters. However, one of the main reasons for this increasing inability to handle media is a decline, he says, in reading, which has made it more difficult for people to locate meaning in text. And when I was teaching at the University of Massachusetts several years ago, I remember I was teaching writing courses, and there was a moment where I found an op-ed, so an opinion piece, and I asked people to try to tell me who is this person. I didn't tell them who the person that was writing it, but I asked people, these students, there were about 19 on average, what kind of person, who is this person that's writing this article, do you think? What is their persuasion? What do you think their belief system is? And they were totally off, right? Because it was a complicated argument that this guy had, and definitely this person, wasn't using the same, wasn't being obvious with what they were trying to say. For me, it was pretty clear, not perfectly clear, but pretty clear, where this person, this author was coming from. But for the students, they were completely lost. It was as if they were in Moscow and their phone had died. They had no idea. They really were completely off. They thought this person was X, and this person was actually arguing completely in favor of the opposite. Because I think a lot of people are used to seeing very obvious things, and when it's not so obvious and it's nuanced, people run away because it takes too much effort. So I encourage you, when possible, not to run away from nuance, to sit with it. Try to, I think some of the best literature, for example, out there is the book where you really don't, you can't say, well, this book is about X, but instead the book is about something that's a little bit more complicated, that makes you think, right? I think we need things that make us think, and we don't need things that we can put in this box or that box. So changing the slide. Is it a simple issue of education? Probably, but there are many factors. While there are numerous good journalists and websites such as Snopes, there's tons of these kinds of fact-checking websites that debunk perpetrated myths. They are no match for the increasing proliferation of falsehoods in circulation, which is why media literacy and critical thinking are important. At a minimum, media literacy can help give people tools to make them better critical thinkers, especially as regards the media. So let's think of changing the slide, a few basic questions a media literate person could ask or answer. I think I've mentioned this before, but asking questions is just as important, perhaps even more important than answering them. And I have a mantra that for media literacy that I repeat over and over again: be skeptical. I mean, I don't sit there and meditate and go, be skeptical, and repeat it 1,000 times till I get in this, kind of zone where I can see information very clearly. But, being skeptical is probably the one thing you should always remind yourself to be. And it's different than cynical, right? Cynicism, when you're cynical, you just don't believe in anything. When you're skeptical, you're like, well, I'll consider that, but I've got some questions that I'm going to ask. Even if I want to believe this, I'm still, wary. I think this could be too good to be true. So I'm going to take a little bit of time. I'm going to pause and examine things, and I'm going to look at another article from a different publication to see if, they're saying largely the same thing. So changing the slide. Being skeptical, a skeptical gene is something you have to acquire, but perhaps an ingrained sense of skepticism is one of the most important traits of a media literate person. It's not a natural gene, though, that we acquire at birth, unless you're maybe the child of a journalist, but one that with knowledge and time you can learn to cultivate, right? But as I said, it does differ from cynicism, which is when you stop believing anything you read due to either a high level of media burnout or something else. Skepticism means you want to believe, but with caution. And as for teachers, discussing what is the difference between skepticism and cynical. This could be an interesting discussion, with your students over the difference between these two terms, especially in relation to media. So question number one, changing the slide. How do media business models lead to or encourage fake news and other less than savory media products? Just changing the slide. In today's fast-paced media cycles, traditional media is in competition with social media. And actually, I don't even know if there are traditional media cycles anymore. I think we're just in one continual loop of incoming news. It could be 3 a.m. and there's stuff posted to a website. It's not just like you go out. I'm old enough to know that I would go out, I would, get up and go to the store at 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning, and pick up the news. And this was the most recent thing that we knew. It was what was printed there, and it just been printed, a couple hours before. It's not like you can go to Twitter and figure out and see what all the updates are. The news is just constantly being updated. Changing the slide again, and in the current media environment, you snooze and you lose, right? There's an enormous need to be first and a dependency on viral media coverage. Therefore, stories are not always checked as well as they could be before being released to the public. Changing the slide again. And one more thing is that the media, we always have to remember, it's a business, right? No matter, it serves at some level its owners, its mission. For the most part, it's beholden to advertising, especially if it's non-state media, right? It needs to survive. It needs this advertising money to survive, and it must make sure that there are plenty of eyeballs on its product. This can impact how a media outlet makes its decisions about what kind of stories to promote. Should we go with the more sensational or more substantial today? I will say this, that the more that you put pressure on and give feedback to media organizations, about the kind of coverage that you want to see, especially if it relates to the more substantial stuff, if they feel like there's an interest and people are going to tune in for the substantial stuff, they'll go with the substantial stuff. But a lot of times the sensational is gone with because people click on it. So this is maybe one little thing you can do, and you can encourage others to do, is don't click on clickbait. Click on what look like good media articles, good media products. All right, switching again the slide to question number 2: how to tell the difference between PR campaigns, propaganda, and actual news. This is more and more challenging, in an era when paid advertising frequently appears in respected media outlets that differ little in appearance from legitimate news stories. I could go right now to any major U.S. media organization, and there's going to be sections. And if I didn't have a trained eye, I wouldn't necessarily know. And they do have some disclosure that they are paid, but if people are looking on their phone and they're looking really quickly, they might not know the difference between this is an advertisement and this is news. There are rules in the United States that govern this, and some modifications are made, and certainly like statements are said, allude to the fact that this is paid advertising. But you still got to know to look for it. If you're not even aware how rampant and frequent this is, you might not catch it every single time, right? Uh, Definitely, traditional media outlets still have more status and authority than social media, so looking like traditional media can help gain credibility amongst questionable sources. So that's another thing, right? People like to advertise in traditional media because they, feel like they'll have more eyeballs on it. They'll be taken more seriously, given more respect. But similarly, there are cases where there are legitimately fake news out there, and they try to look like traditional media organizations. So definitely, if you look at a site and you're like, wait a second, is this real? Or take a look at the website and do a search of that website to make sure. Is there something slightly off about that website? Like sometimes they'll, let's say they want to be like WashingtonPost.com. They want to look like that. They'll be like, Washington News dot something else. Check all that kind of stuff. There are signs in there for sure. Go to just try to see if like that news appears somewhere else. So try to search the headlines in Google or Yandex or something like that and see if it appears elsewhere. If not, you might have actually stumbled across a piece of fake news trying to play the part of looking like a traditional news organization. Changing the slide again, right? So what do you do? Just in general, if I have one piece of advice, keep your guard up and be skeptical. What that means is any piece of news you look at, just don't start reading it until you've taken a look around. It's like when you come into a new hotel room, take a look around for a minute before you put your things down and start opening drawer. Start putting your stuff away, right? Similarly, when you're reading the media, take a look at it and think for a second before you act on it or make assumptions. Changing the slide again. So question number 3: how do search engines manipulate the information we have access to? Changing the slide again. So when we enter a term into a search engine, we're not freely swimming around the web, right? We're not 100% in control. Algorithms influence and sometimes even decide what you're looking for in search engines. So, changing the slide again, all sorts of things can happen in search engines, right? Businesses have been known to pay to change results. There's such a thing as net neutrality laws. This is a situation where perhaps the internet company could favor one type of information over another. There could be money involved with that, in terms of changing results and stuff like that. Depending on the country, certain information could be omitted. Definitely, if you travel around the world, you do not, get the same results when you punch in the same terms, even in the same search engines. And as well, artificial intelligence is playing a bigger and bigger role in helping companies decide how and when to increase or decrease the prices you're quoted online, in terms of shopping, right? They try to figure out your emotional state sometimes, although probably artificial intelligence, I don't know what it's doing these days because they're so desperate to get people to buy anything, that maybe they have had to switch things up. But back, even 6 months ago when economies around the world seemed like they were doing pretty good, there was a lot of competition for stuff, and artificial intelligence was very involved in that competition and helping companies figure out how much to charge for a certain product. Changing the slide again, there's no need to despair, but there are a lot of things to be aware of in this area. Changing the slide again. Question 4, what is confirmation bias? Changing the slide again. Confirmation bias is one of the key terms of media literacy. It's when your deeply held beliefs get in the way of objectivity. It's why it is so hard to convince someone that their beliefs, their facts are wrong, even if the facts say otherwise, right? The world is flat. No, the world is round. No, I say the world is flat. And I'm not going to change my mind. These kinds of situations. That's an extreme version of it, obviously. But changing the slide to define it more formally, confirmation bias is a tendency we have to filter and recall information in a way that confirms what you already believe or think. It's right. It's when your desire for something to be true has a direct impact on your beliefs. You want to believe it, so it becomes true, right? It just confirms what you already believe is what confirmation bias. It's like you want the world to be flat, and you're attracted naturally to articles that tell you that the world is flat. You're like, see, I knew I was right. Even though there's a lot of other information out there, you disregard it and go straight towards the information that confirms what you already believe. Changing the slide again. Confirmation bias is extraordinarily prevalent in societies around the world, and very little understood. But if left unchecked, it can compel you into believing things that are simply not true or even scientifically unsound. Confirmation bias has played an enormous role in the last 4 months in terms of what people believe about COVID-19, for sure. So learning about your own confirmation bias and how it operates is a crucial step, in my own opinion, in becoming a truly media literate individual. And for teachers, examining this concept could lead to some interesting assignments. So to wrap up, a media literate person is conscious of what is going on around them, right? They become naturally skeptical and can often figure out when they're being sold something. They have an idea when information is incomplete and have ideas about where to look to fill in the gaps. Changing the slide again, a media literate person also recognizes that the media universe that they live in today is vast and limitless, but at the same time, they don't get overwhelmed. Can you stop all fake news stories from flying around the internet at lightning speed? Probably not. But most important thing is, and I said this to students that I was teaching in the university all the time. And this is probably even for me, one of the most important things for me to remember as an adult is you need to choose your battles, right? You can't go after everything. You've got to choose, life is only so long, and you've got to choose your priorities and keep everything in perspective, right? You can't change everything, but maybe focus on the things where you can have an impact, right? Maybe it's not the best use of your time to sit there on Facebook arguing in different Facebook groups about stuff, against people who are there purely for the battle, purely to say, no, you're wrong, you're stupid, this, that, and the other thing. Maybe it's better off to spend a little time with your grandparents and talk to them about media, or your colleagues, or your children, or your other relatives, friends, and so on. Maybe that is a place where you have trust and you can have an impact in talking to people about sharing that information. Changing the slide again. As a teacher, there are numerous opportunities for adapting your curriculum to incorporate some of these concepts. Changing the slide again. Begin by asking your students what they think, what they've heard, why they think media literacy is important, if they think it's important. No matter what, people are going to have things to say about this. And you could create an entire language class. You could do 10 weeks, where you just take some of the ideas that I've talked about in these media literacy presentations. And, I think some students, especially once you get to a pretty high level, they get tired of reading the same, stories about, that are in textbooks. Maybe they want to do something different. This is a good way to build up some vocabulary and also feel like you're getting something besides just language out of it. And so there's a lot of different possibilities here. Changing the slide again. One thing you can do is encourage students to keep a media consumption diary in which they self-analyze their media habits. Okay, today's Wednesday. I shared 2 things on Instagram, 2 stories from photos I took in the park yesterday. And I forwarded, I shared something that my friend said because I thought it was funny or because it made me angry. I commented on my uncle's Facebook page because they were saying something that was wrong, and I did some chatting on WhatsApp, just something like that. But I think most people aren't aware of what it is they're doing with media and social media and traditional media, and getting to know that can be really eye-opening about what you're doing. Most importantly, for teachers who having a hard time getting started, do a self-examination of what your own media consumption habits are, as well as maybe poll your family and friends. That should be enough to get you started for sure. So to the final slide, I thank you for your attention, and I am ready to take any questions or comments that you may have. All right, I've got a comment from Marina Mayakina. Thank you. It was very informative and interesting to follow. Thank you, Marina. Don't think I've seen you here before, so please tune in again. Got another comment from Natalia Daliechina. Thank you. It was very interesting. Yes, Natalia, thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again. Got a question from Grapefruit Orange, who's a frequent listener to this series. Thank you for the presentation. How is media literacy taught in American high schools? This is a good question. I definitely don't have a quick answer to that. I do know it is being introduced in some American high schools, but like everything in the United States, nothing is uniform. Nothing is uniform in this country. If COVID-19 response and everything that is become abundantly clear that every place has its own kind of response to this. I think it's being introduced in some high schools, and my guess is that is probably barely taught at all in others. I'm gonna talk to some friends. Now that I'm back in the U.S. for a little while, who are high school teachers, and I'm gonna ask them to find out a little bit more information. But I don't know exactly. My understanding is that it is taught in some high schools, usually probably just as a couple of classes. I think at the far end, there maybe is a class in 10th or 11th grade that really focuses on this stuff for a semester, but I don't think it goes beyond that. And I think there's a lot of room for growth for sure. I think the impression, people in Russia always ask me, "Oh, this is probably taught all the time," and I don't think it's taught as much as you'd think. But I think most high school students have some level of presentation about it. But I don't think it's like a year-long class or anything. Should it be? In my opinion, yes, but I don't think it's there. But I'm going to make it my mission in the next couple of months to learn a little bit more and talk to some high school teachers while I'm here about how it is being approached. I do know that in certain places in Europe, for example, it is taught. As far as I understand, in Finland, it's taught quite a bit, and maybe even an entire subject for an entire school year. Germany, it's taught. But regardless, it's not taught as much as it should be. I think this is something that probably beginning in middle school, age 12, 13, that point where people are starting to use as soon as people are starting to use social media and do research, I think they should be introduced to how to use it effectively. Now, it's a little bit differently because certain aspects of media in conjunction, and I could speak to this. This was true even when I was in school, and is certainly true at the university level today. Is that aspects of media literacy are taught throughout high school and university. They're just not called that separate subject. So for example, anytime you do a research paper, they're going to spend a lot of time on how to figure out what's good sources and stuff like that. But that's more of an academic type thing. But those lessons are generally applicable to the wider media kind of space, right? Often in American high schools and universities, you have to come up with a bibliography, show it to your instructor, and say, are these good sources or not? And you do have to do some of that. And I'd say that's generally true for most American high school and certainly all university students. But it's still not as deep, doesn't go as deep as I think it should. And does it apply to social media? Not as much as it should. Like that kind of stuff should really come pretty early on in life. But I'm not going to pretend to be a complete expert. Maybe I'm completely wrong on this. Maybe it is being taught, as complete classes in every high school in America, and I just don't know. So I'm definitely going to spend some time in the upcoming months this summer trying to learn a little bit more about that. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, starting next week, we're going to transfer to a Zoom format. It doesn't mean you have to, participate. You can be there with your microphone muted and, your video. We don't need to see you, but it does provide the opportunity to have something more of a discussion throughout the presentation and certainly at the end of the presentation. Although you can still chat in your, your comments. And your questions for sure, but it does provide a little bit more possibility for interaction. So just be aware that you do need Zoom, which is an easily downloadable thing. It's if you don't have it, and just to be aware of that when you're preparing to tune in next week. I believe it's July 7th, so I think it's next Tuesday evening is when we will have the next session. So with that. I will say goodbye, and we thank you for tuning in for this session of the Media Literacy Discussion Club. Please don't be a stranger. Let us know what you thought about this program by liking it or leaving a comment. To join our other online AMC online programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out updates on our website, amc.ru, and follow us on social media to learn, connect, and produce together. Have a good evening. I'll see you hopefully next week. Thank you.